Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Since 2001, Neil Rodford has been CEO of YMU Group, the global talent management company for elite clients in sport, music, drama, comedy and entertainment. With multiple offices globally, YMU represent leading athletes, artists, actors, social creators, producers, comedians, TV personalities and experts. He was thrust into the spotlight aged just 26, when in 1996 he was appointed Managing Director of Fulham Football Club, following its acquisition by then Harrods owner Mohammed Al Fayed. So how does a lad from Somerset go from the glare of the Premier League floodlights to being the go-to man for the best the red carpet has to offer? Without further ado, let's get into it. So first and foremost, Neil, welcome to the Extrology podcast. Great to have you on. So tell me, I'd like to start, if I may, with the early years. Neil Rodford, the young lad, or younger lad, shall we say. So where did you grow up? Where did life start?
So hi, Lee. Thanks for inviting me on. So I'm originally from a little village called Ash, which is in Somerset, about 5 or 6 miles from Yeovil in the southwest of England.
Interesting. So big family, running around in fields, brothers, sisters, climbing trees and all that sort of good stuff as a kid?
Yeah, it was good. My grandparents were dairy farmers, so I grew up on a farm. My grandparents are saying my parents separated when I was 4, and I think a lot of my characteristics are formed actually from those sort of formative years, very classic Freudian sort of heritage in terms of my personality. So I then moved with my mum into Yeovil itself, whilst my siblings actually remained in the small village. They were quite a bit older than me, so we were separated at quite a young age, both my parents and my siblings. So I spent my week in Yeovil, which seemed like a big place at the time, and my weekends in the sort of leafy village of Ash. So I had quite two different experiences at a young age, which I think shaped a lot of my character as I got older. So I have two older brothers and an adopted sister from 6 months who lives with me. So yeah, lives with my mum during the week and my parents and father at the weekends.
And in terms of when growing up, you know, the kind of posters on wall type stuff, you know, who did you look up to? Who inspired you? Tell me a bit about those early years and what you were into.
I don't remember being inspired too many people, actually. I think because I was naturally, my real passion was football. So a lot of it would have come from actually somebody who became my first client, Kevin Keegan, fortuitously. So I sort of remember I was a big West Ham fan. I used to go and watch Yeovil Town with my eldest brother. So it was all football orientated, really. It was people that at the time were sort of aspirational football figures would have been my inspiration. I don't remember having lots of inspiration. I actually found childhood quite difficult, if I was honest, that's sort of personally. So a lot of the time it was about survival and sort of getting through what seemed really difficult emotionally for me at the time. But yeah, definitely all of the aspirational characters would have been footballers.
Interesting. So how does a lad from Somerset end up becoming managing director of Fulham Football Club in the mid-90s? I mean, that's a big leap. And I'm guessing at that point you'd have been, what, in your mid-20s, something like that? I mean, respectfully, a young age to be taking on such a huge responsibility when the glare of the Premier League was just starting to shine bright. You'd have been, what, 4 years into Premier League football at that point, 4 or 5 years, something like that. And Fulham, obviously, at that time, and still to this day, but particularly at that time, a very high-profile club. So what was I know that's an enormous leap to go from a young lad to, what was the journey? Talk us through it.
So relatively brief. I think I've had a history within my career of finding people that gave me opportunities, probably in advance of where my ability or track record was. So I'd spent a long time at that stage working for WH Smith, but not on the retail side, the high street side, WH Smith News, which was a distributor of newspapers and magazines. And I was sponsored by a very senior executive in that organisation who went on to lead it, a guy called Brendan Fitzmaurice. And he just took a shine to me from a very young age. When I was 17 in Yeovil, he'd given me the opportunity to move to Cornwall, Bodmin of all places. And through that experience with him, kept on sponsoring me. So I'd had quite a meteoric rise through that organisation, about 9 or 10 promotions in about the less than 9 years, actually, with WH Smith. And I'd ended up in their head office in London, in Holborn. And then I got headhunted to go and work for a startup for Mohammed Al Fayed, which at the time the aspiration was for it to be a newspaper, publisher of magazines, radio stations, and I'd left WH Smith to go and work for him and spent about a year, 18 months doing it, not particularly successfully. And he had taken a shine to me in the same way that Brendan Fitzmaurice did, and called me across one day and said, "What do you know about football?" Coming back to what we talked about at the start, that was my real passion and knowledge. And brought me in to say, "Look, I'm going to acquire Fulham Football Club." And literally said, "Look, I want you to go down there," and I think he called it general manager at the time, "You be general manager. And this is the person that's going to be the front of it." And he literally opened the door, coming back to sort of having that role model character. In the room was Kevin Keegan. So it was really being in the right place at the right time and having somebody that was going to give me a shot, because I was 26, had no real credentials whatsoever to run a football club in any way, shape or form, other than I obviously was a reasonable business person at that stage and I'd done a lot. So yeah, at 26 years of age, you've got Kevin, Mohammed Al Fayed, and we launched the press conference, and Mohammed said, "We're going to be the Manchester United of the South." I always remember it with all these cameras here. And at that point, we were just getting promoted out of what is now League Two. So this huge comment, two incredibly high-profile individuals, the whole media glare of the nation there, and it was incredibly exciting and incredibly scary in equal measure.
So what is it? I want to go into that in a bit of depth, if I may, but if we just go back a step with respect to Brendan first and foremost, and then subsequently Mohammed Al Fayed, what is it that you think that they saw in you? What did they see in you that identified you as a rising star?
I think there's a couple of things, probably, if I'm truthful and try and look at my career. I think I've obviously got a sheer desire to be recognised, an element of, I've always been quite insecure, so being recognised by people in authority or people that I look up to. I think I have an element of people seeing a sense of desire to please or work hard, a sheer level of commitment. I think that comes back from my early years, which we touched on at the start. And I think I'm reasonably good at learning quickly, especially where there's sort of human capital or people. I think I've got a high level of emotional intelligence, seem to have an ability to align individuals around me towards some sort of common cause. So I think they saw somebody that wanted to be given an opportunity, and if I was given that, I wouldn't let them down. So a sense of being trustworthy, being responsible, being, highly communicative, being respectful. And also there's an element of me, weirdly, with all of those insecurities, there's an element of bravery, is that the right term? So somebody that's prepared to take on a challenge, probably, which often is greater than, again, my experience. But that inner sense of I can do this, and sheer determination to keep going. A lot of it's based, if I go back to my early career, this sheer number of hours probably been consistent that I've put in. In my early days at WH Smith, I would sometimes start, and this isn't false, I would sometimes start at 2:00 in the morning, driving a van, meeting the newspapers and magazines being delivered from Wapping at that stage, or Waterloo into Yeovil, unpacking them, distributing them, literally driving a van to delivering it, and then working in the office all day. And the quid pro quo at the time was that if I was prepared to put the hours in, that people would give me the opportunity. So that was a recurring theme. I've always worked disproportionately long hours, and I think that's sometimes because I'm not the most academic, so I always thought in my subconscious, I may not be the most talented, but nobody's going to work harder than me. And I think that's almost where Kevin Keegan and I had that chemistry, because Kevin was renowned for being not the most talented, but nobody was ever going to work harder than him on the pitch. So that's probably where our chemistry started from a young age.
So if you go back to that day in 1996, when Mohammed Al Fayed opens the door and in you walk and there sat Kevin Keegan, how did you feel? Can you remember the range of emotions that you must have been going through at that time?
So difficult to describe because it was too good to be true. All the things that one would imagine if you're whatever your aspirational character is, to walk in and see somebody of his stature, and then to be spending literally time like hanging out. So working during the day, but in the evening going for dinner or going for a walk, around Hyde Park or Fulham or the training ground in Motspur Park. And not only through Kevin, meeting obviously people that were in the public eye as athletes or as business people was just unbelievably fortuitous. I couldn't believe it. It was so exciting and so scary, because I think the scare side of it was, well, what about if somebody takes this away from me? And therefore I go back to being sort of, anonymous Neil. I think that's probably what the biggest fear was, actually somebody saying, look, you're not good enough to do this, or you've made a mistake. So that was probably the other side of it, but just incredibly exciting. And he was such a generous person to me in terms of introducing me to the football world. In the same way, Mohammed was quite a divisive character, but always very good to me, never asked me to do anything unprofessional in any way, shape or form. So I just felt really lucky. And I think the fear has always been with me, as somebody says to me, you're not good enough, and it gets taken away.
So where do you start? You walk into a football, to your point, no previous experience of running a football club. Where do you even begin to start in that scenario?
I suppose for me, and I don't know how, it's for others to say how well I did, but I always, in any new business, and I've gone on and done other verticals that I didn't know too much about, music, television, drama and comedy. So these other areas subsequently that I got introduced to. I started, I think, at the time by speaking to the incumbent people. There was only about 20 staff at the time at Fulham. I remember a lady called Sandra Coles who ran the ticket office and had done for many years, or Kevin Moore, who at the time was the operations man, had sadly passed away, played many games for Southampton, Grimsby and others. So two characters, the Muddymans that were the previous owner, father and son. So for me, often the starting point is to try and be big enough to really go and talk to them and just listen, whilst obviously one forms views and wants to take it in a direction. So you knew the direction of travel from the owner. That was clear. We're going to be the Manchester United of the South, which we never quite achieved. But then speaking to the people, listening to Kevin, obviously. And I was always really aware that my job was to try and make the back office, i.e. the stadium, the training grounds, the administration. That was my role. I wasn't going to be the one that was going to go and sign the players. So to go and talk to people and listen, and that shapes sometimes, doesn't it? Like all of us, that gives you views instantly, both good and bad. You form opinions on people quickly, which is always a negative, really, if you have too quick an opinion, in my experience. But that's what happens. And then to try and weed out the fundamental principles at the time of what we needed to do in order to move forward, which were really basic things like we needed a trading ground. The stadium wasn't health and safety compliant. We needed to work with the local authority and residents around, the capacity going up significantly. And of course, we needed to invest in the squad in order to move up through the leagues and, hire a manager. So, Kevin's first choice was Mickey Adams went, and then we hired Ray Wilkins. So some of that you get, don't you, 3 or 4 big decisions, right or wrong, and it moves you forward in any organisation relatively quickly or backwards.
I think the thing that struck me about football, I remember a conversation fair few years ago now, but a recruitment-related conversation for some hiring that I was doing for, at the time, what was it still is, Premier League Football Club. And the conversation had turned to the fact that if you look at that back office operation, if you look at the business itself and the people employed within the business, separate from the playing staff, you can do the very best job in the world. You can set up a world-class environment with fabulous employees, great culture, all those kind of good things. But arguably the success factor is dictated by not quite 11 these days. It's a bigger squad, but 11 people on a playing field for 90 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. Your stock rises or falls on the strength of what those people deliver. So it's really interesting that, the feel, the atmosphere around the club can rise or fall. How do you manage that? How do you manage, if you like, the business and all that would entail around people versus the very emotional nature of what sport imparts?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think there's good examples even in the Premier League today. If you see the symbiotic relationship between, say, Klopp and the owners versus maybe the adversarial relationship of other clubs, which are well documented. You can pick out other examples historically of Sunderland as an example because of it's quite in the public domain. So I think there is a relationship, and success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds investment maybe sometimes. So I think you're right. I think at the stage we were incredibly successful on the pitch. It wasn't a straight line, but predominantly going in the right direction. I think that gave the owner the confidence to invest more capital and trust in the choices of Kevin and the management team on the playing side. And alongside that, you try and run along with it. There was lots of criticism from the supporters. They weren't happy about Mohammed Al Fayed buying a football club. They thought he had an ulterior financial motive to redevelop the ground, which was well documented. The stadium wasn't fit for purpose at the time to be a Premier League club. So, there was lots of things there. We were trying to buy a training ground in West London, which is notoriously difficult. So there was lots to do. But the fact that we were predominantly winning on the pitch made everything else so much easier, both from a supporter's perspective and a momentum. And I think, aligning organisations, particularly sporting ones, where you're judged in the eyes of, the club belongs to the supporters ultimately, doesn't it? And that's the recurring theme. So success on the pitch is fundamental, but that alignment between owner, back office and manager is fundamental. And I think that's probably true in most organisations, whether you want to use words like culture or leadership. I think trying to align as many people around a common goal is powerful and well documented. And in a people business, which is ultimately what a football club is, both from the players on the pitch through to the ownership structure, I think those marginal gains are fundamentally important and are much more transparent. When sporting institutions aren't aligned, it becomes relatively obvious because you've got so many people looking at it.
What do you think you learned from the Fulham experience?
I learned a couple of things about me personally. I probably wasn't confident enough from a self-esteem perspective to be in the public eye because you're judged. In those days, it was message boards and fan forums, and I felt vulnerable. So when I was criticised, I think that hit harder than the time I looked up to people like David Dean and David Gill, who were really good to me. Theo Pathetis at Millwall, people that had been in the public eye Peter Kenyon, been in the public eye for a long time. And they were built differently to me and more able to cope with the criticism as well as the praise. So I was very sensitive. That was one thing.
That's interesting. You say built differently. How much of that is a reference to, respectfully, if you look at that time, as I would imagine, if my memory serves me right. So the age gap, for example, between you and them, they've got at that point arguably 20 years on you in terms of experience, not only business experience, people experience, worldly experience, all the kind of things. How much of that do you think was a reference to your age as much as anything else, your maturity from a business perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not always a huge advocate of experience. I think most entrepreneurial businesses, most businesses that change the world tend to be, there's a reason why they're formulated by young people, because they're almost inexperienced allows them to do things that more experienced people would not. It definitely, when you look at somebody like David Dean, who was an incredibly gifted operator and brilliant and very, very accessible to me. I learned a couple of lessons on transfers and things through that. But without doubt, obviously, maybe age gives you a bit more, you've been through it a few times. But I think the theme of me being slightly insecure about any public spotlight, hence the reason I've not done too many of these things, has recurred throughout my whole career. And I'm now 51, so I'm the age of some of the people that you refer to. So there's a little bit of that. But also I think some people, Karen at the time, Karen Brady, was a similar age to me, and she was running Birmingham, and she stayed in that public spotlight and consistently done a very high profile roles, and she was very young and a female, so it made it even harder. So there were other peers at my time that were more equipped. So I think the takeaway for me is be careful about putting myself too much into the public arena, although I've always been surrounded by people that were in the public spotlight, was one takeaway. And two, I suppose the positive was that it was an incredibly successful period, and lots of other sporting organisations have tried and failed. So I must have done something right, So in that sense, it gave me an inner confidence to believe that given the opportunity, I could succeed.
What do you put that success down to?
I'd like to say, I come back to, I think my gift from a young age why I was given opportunities is I think I'm reasonably good at understanding how to get the best out of others. I think that's probably my gift. So I always believe that you keep coming back to align people around a common purpose. And at the time, the purpose was to get the back office, the organisational structure of Fulham equipped for the Premier League, and obviously to have the players on the pitch. So that's a lot of that is to do with budget and actually, encouraging the owner at the time to keep investing a huge amount of money. I always remember when we signed Chris Coleman from Blackburn, who's gone on to have an incredible career. He was such an inspirational character, far better than the level that we were playing at, which in the stage was League One. And that was down to Kevin, almost being that character. If we hadn't have Kevin and Ray and people at the time, then those players wouldn't have come. But also the whole on-field performance was structured around his personality. He was a leader. He was clearly somebody that was good in the bad times, as always referred to. So you had, columns, didn't you? Pillars of strength from the owner that was putting money in. You still had the heritage of the historic owners. You had Kevin, you had Ray. And then on the field, you had real leaders. Chris Coleman was something that you could build around. So, coming back to any organisation, in sport, it's often the spine of the team that people would talk about. But I think that applies both on and off the pitch and to any organisation. And for me, I think I hopefully was strong. I was resilient. I was committed. I was the communicator, almost the fetcher and carrier in a football sense, that was acting as a conduit between Kevin and the owner, or the Muddymans, or the staff. I always saw myself as being sort of like a communication filter for which decisions could get made and seen through. Because often, again, making decisions is easy. Executing them is sometimes harder. And I think I didn't mind doing what were the less glamorous roles, really, the communication. And I think that's probably true throughout my career. I'm happy to be involved in the detail.
It's a really interesting insight as well. Before we move on from Fulham, really interesting insight into, I kind of think the best way to describe it is managing up. You've got a very, very high profile owner, very much in the public eye, particularly around that time. You've got Kevin Keegan involved, who of himself was been coming off the back of a fabulous run at Newcastle and all that would entail. When again, he was very much in the public eye. Then obviously subsequently went on to become England manager. So as high a profile in English football terms as you're likely to have. You've got big characters on the pitch, inevitably. I know it takes all sorts within a football team, within any team, but you've also got those big characters, the likes of a Chris Coleman. So that must have been, in terms of learning how to get the best out of people, for people and with people, that of itself must have been, for every management course on which you might any one of us might possibly participate, that's as raw a lesson I'd imagine that you could possibly have hoped for at that stage in your career.
Yeah, I always say football clubs, they are very small businesses, but they have FTSE 100 profile. So I think that's what you take. I think anybody that's ran an organisation of that scale from a PR perspective, there are a lot of learnings because you are judged, criticised, complimented, that you get tested about character a lot in that sense. And that's what I would take away from it. And yeah, you're seeing some people heavily criticised in the public domain or listening to it on radio or in the newspapers and seeing how people respond. And there's a reason probably why I've been successful around talent subsequently and seen it over a long period of time, because what separates most talent, in my opinion, is that mental resilience. And some people cope with that by not reading. Some people cope with that by reading everything. Obviously, some people cope with counselling and support networks, but actually at their core, I think the really elite are just mentally different to the 99.99% of the population. Their resilience and strength mentally, obviously with usually a huge amount of talent aligned, is what separates them. And Kevin was a unique individual, somebody that was often criticised, but incredible track record of success. Pretty much everywhere he'd been, and I think all the way through his career, he had a degree of success, which probably doesn't get the credit that he deserves when you look at his track record. And look what he did at Fulham. Without Fulham or the owner, Mohammed was a really, really good owner for Fulham Football Club when you consider where it had been prior to his involvement.
Well, I think for people, there perhaps might be a tendency to forget, to your point around Kevin Keegan. I mean, he was European Footballer of the Year. I think that
Twice.
And you see, that's the equivalent. That's the modern day equivalent of, today you would put him in the same category as a Lionel Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo in terms of the magnitude of that achievement. If you look at those Ballon d'Or winners. So I mean, he's a huge character, and I think oftentimes that can get forgotten.
Definitely, and he definitely, made people leave that Newcastle period. Or, I was really fortunate to be in the changing rooms and it's obviously going to impact me because I would have loved to have been on the pitch and was never near good enough. But I remember being at Old Trafford, we played Man United, I think it was in London, like the fifth round of the FA Cup, and listening to a talk from Kevin to the squad. I was in like the toilets, hidden away so nobody could see me, and hearing it, and it made me, I actually thought, that saying, you thought you could run through brick walls. It was like, one, I can't believe I'm lucky enough to hear this, but two, actually give me a pair of boots and some shorts and I actually might be able to go out and contribute. So he was a very, very, very special character. And in his own way, as I say, Mohammed Al Fayed was a special character because saying things like we're going to be the Man United of the South and we're going to have the best facilities and all this. I mean, who normally says that North Star? Most people say that, especially in sport, which brought a whole load of challenges. But to be fair to him, we got to the Premier League and maybe by, shooting for the stars, we got somewhere close to it. So it was, a really, really lucky period. I was, some of the best nights or day, you look back on your life, there are some 3 or 4 highs there that I will never, ever forget, incredibly unique moments.
Well, it's certainly a great example. The first thing that struck me when you mentioned that Man United of the South, which I'd forgotten about, is if you think about that in the business context, aligning people behind, that's a hell of a vision. and actually aligning people around, arguably, absolutely I don't know if it's a uniquely British characteristic, but we love a tall poppy, don't we? We love to set ourselves up or set our high profile figures up to fail. So somebody will grab a statement like that and you become a laughing stock if you don't achieve it. But the fact that he was prepared to be big enough and bold enough to make that statement, and actually to your point, we're shooting for the stars, but we, to be honest, Fulham did, you made the moon. I mean, I think that's certainly as I would recall it. So great times. And I'm not surprised that you enjoyed the experiences that you did. Which takes me on to, and there's a consistent theme around talent management, which is rattling at the back of my brain throughout all of this. Is YMU. So what's the story? How did you arrive to be CEO 2002, 2001, 2002?
Yeah.
YMU's obviously been the last 20 years of your life. What was the story behind YMU? How did you end up there?
So there's a relatively quick way to get to that. So my first deal, I'd obviously bought players for Fulham, but I did Kevin's deal to go to England at the time with Adam Crozier and David Davis. So that was the first time I'd negotiated a deal maybe for a talent or an individual. So I did that deal. And then actually I'd worked at Fulham and for Mohammed for about 5 years. And so Kevin and I talked about me going and representing him. He had an idea, a few business ideas. So I started, I suppose, I set up on my own with Kevin, representing him, and instantly found, coming back to that sort of vulnerability point, didn't necessarily excel by being on my own. I wasn't a big enough character on my own. I didn't have this aspiration wasn't financially driven. I needed people around me. I felt like I was more of a leader. So there was leading oneself is quite difficult. So at the stage, I knew Paul Stretford, Kevin Moran, Jesper Olsen, that had a company based in the northwest of England, which was quite an established football agency at the time. And he'd spoken to me a few times, or they had, about joining them, which is what I did. And then we floated that small football agency on the stock market. I think I was CEO at the start, and a couple of years later took over as CEO. And again, the idea at that stage is you've got a football agency, which we had offices in several international territories, Holland, Australia, Greece. But it was pretty clear that you couldn't scale a talent business around being a football agency, or I didn't think you could. And I'd spent a little bit of time looking to the US and seen IMG and William Morris, as it was at the time. Subsequently, now you've got William Morris, Endeavour, UTA, some of these scaled businesses. But there was no UK integrated management company. And what I mean by integrated, looking after talent across, music, sport, entertainment. So started off on quite an ambitious journey at that stage to say, well, let's try and create the CEA or the WME of Europe. And that was the vision, similar to the North Star that Mohammed started out. The only difference this time is that I was running it and we were using external capital. So we were listed from 2001 till 2009. And then I led the first management buyout in 2009 with a company called Gresham. But never really changed the concept about, I had this idea that you put the talent in the room, whoever they be, an athlete, a musician, a writer, and then I always had a concept that you would surround that individual with people that could add to them in, say, way any corporation would, or family office. You would have a marketing person, a salesperson, a legal person, a relationship person. And that was the idea, really. And sort of 20 years later, we've just been on that drive, and that's been built up through organic growth or acquisition.
So what gave you that belief that the model would work? To your point, as I understand it, pre-YMU, that integrated agency hadn't existed. Why was that? How was the market made up historically?
So I think still to this day, predominantly in Europe, less so in the US, you've got very, what I call vertically integrated management companies. So people that specialize in one sector. So you've got, music management companies, drama companies, TV companies, they're people that, specialize in that one sector, but there was no business that was across all of those verticals. But that had been proven in the US. So where the US goes, often I believe we follow, certainly historically that's been the case. So the model was proven, and it was on steroids in the US. You were talking about, I think WME pre-COVID had about 7,500 employees. CA up to about 2,500. So the model was there, and it wasn't like we were trying to do something that hadn't been proven elsewhere. And I think for me, at my core, I actually believe if you are in the public eye, and talent's the word that often gets referred to in that, your needs are pretty consistent, whether you're a musician, an athlete, an actress, a writer, whatever you want to say, a TV host. There are consistent themes around what one needs. So therefore, the transferable skills from one, being a football agent, is what I was at the time, to representing TV hosts, actually the characteristics and the people that surrounded those talent were relatively similar. They're often perceived to being different, but my experience would tell me otherwise.
What is it that you think that you have that enabled you? Two questions in one, never a good premise, I apologise, but nonetheless, what is it that you think that you possess that enabled you to see the potential? And what is it that you think that has meant that you've been able to fulfill that potential?
I think that's quite hard for me to answer that with any form of clarity, because I've definitely got a lot of things wrong, by the way. We're talking about the things that have gone well. I've definitely made a lot of mistakes.
I would explore that, because I think that's how we learn, isn't it? I mean, I think there isn't a person alive, very absolutely brave of you to admit it, but I think that's often a challenge. Everybody makes mistakes. I think that's where so often the biggest learnings come from.
I suppose, where does one get that from? It was so obvious to me personally that when you look to the US, that there was an opportunity to scale and integrate in the UK. And I don't think I think other people maybe have seen that opportunity. And then we started to implement it, and it started to work. So the first couple of acquisitions that we did, we actually bought a business management company, or accountancy, as they would call it in the UK, that manages basic things, compliance things like VAT returns, company returns, tour accounting. And we bought a TV business headed up by a guy called Peter Powell in television. And as we started to do these things, the challenge was actually not so much the business logic of that, but it was about getting people to come together to align under a common brand or a common cause, because all these businesses had their own identity and culture. But actually, when you started to represent clients, hopefully some of these won't mind me mentioning their name, but when you represent Ant and Dec, you're representing obviously a brand that's well known in the public arena and has lots of different needs. So bringing complementary skills from PR, commercial, business affairs, tour and accounting, all those kind of things, then you actually start to add complementary skills to these people, under one umbrella. So I suppose the implementation of the model started to work, and it just gave me confidence to do more of it. But the challenge always, most mergers and acquisitions fail, don't they, statistically? And it's seldom to do with the business and much more to do with culture and how you integrate people or organizations.
And how do you, and that subject fascinates me, because I think if I look at those businesses that have been through that experience that I've read about, that I've worked with, that I'm aware of, that I've talked to people who've been in that scenario, I think one of the biggest challenges is, you acquire a business, and to your point, particularly around people, talent management, human capital is the secret sauce, the DNA ultimately, I guess, that you're acquiring. There's systems, there's processes, there's all those kind of good things, but fundamentally you're buying a bulk of capable people and trying to integrate them into your organization, but without losing any of the secret sauce or overly diluting the secret sauce you've acquired. And that's an enormous challenge. And I think probably why a lot of acquisitions do fail, because that's the really hard stuff. The processes, the systems that wrap around it, not without challenges, but can be overcome. The people bit is the really hard bit because there's so many shades of grey. How do you you've enjoyed a lot of success with YMU's growth around that M&A strategy. How have you made it work?
So I think there's two answers to that I would try and say that I've done relatively consistency. So number one is, I think generally people are good. So when you're trying to acquire a business, I think sitting with the principals and the owners and trying to distill what is the motivation. It could be capital, it could be status, it could be tiredness, it could be opportunity because they want more capital to grow. So really taking time to sit with people, which often gets undervalued in my experience, because often it's done through corporate advisors doing financial and legal DD, but it doesn't get to the essence of somebody. So actually spending time with people. And I don't mean getting drunk and partying. I mean sitting with somebody and saying to them, look, talk a bit like what you're doing kindly with me today, but tell me your journey, what's got you here. More importantly, what is driving you to make this decision? So trying to understand that is really important. And that's not easy. And I think that has to be done with an element of sincerity, and then sort of baking that back into the existing organization and say, look, with those characteristics, that drive and motivation, what are going to be the challenges, and talking about those because they become relatively clear. I always say things like, are people prepared to change the company's name? Are they prepared to close their building and integrate with others? Who do they report to? All of those are real drivers of whether people, why they're doing it. Because if they say, well, I don't want to change my name, I want to stay in the same building, I don't want to report to anybody, then obviously there's a lot of red flags there. It's surprising how often deals still happen, even with those criteria. So there's an element of that. And the other one that I used to aspire to when I was younger was I always thought consistency from a leadership perspective was something to aspire to and look up to. So if I was consistently making decisions, then some way that was a good leadership style. And then maybe the only thing with experience taught me a little bit. I talk a lot internally with my colleagues about being grey. Grey's okay. Whereas black and white, to me, sometimes is almost the enemy of that. So being consistently inconsistent around decision making, and that sometimes has its consequences internally. But if you're trying to attract entrepreneurial, exceptional talent, both on the pitch, if we go back to a sport analogy, or on the screen or on the stage, then you have to accept that there are some consequences of that. So I would always talk a lot internally about giving people the freedom to be in themselves while trying to have some sort of overarching strategy.
Interesting. So if you look back to the early days of YMU, if you go back 15 years or so, is there one decision that stands out for you that you took that you felt was instrumental, pivotal in your success, and what might that be?
Yeah, the thing that comes into my mind instantly is I was fortunate. There was a founder of a business which was known quite a lot in the UK called James Grant, which was founded by Russ Lindsay and Peter Powell. And we'd heard through the Times that business was up for sale and it was going to be sold to somebody else. And I remember going to the wrong tube station. I went to Kew Gardens rather than Kew Bridge. And it was pouring with rain, and it was about 2 miles away from the office strand on the green down in Chiswick. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be late. So I'm turning up. I was still relatively young, I suppose. Peter was quite a bit older, incredibly successful Radio 1 DJ, had founded this business. I turn up soaking wet, about 20 minutes late. And sitting in an office down on Strand on the Green and sitting with Peter. And this individual that I think had taken a meeting with me just out of curiosity rather than substance, and sitting with him in the same way that you look to a Kevin or Mohammed or someone, and actually seeing somebody that oozed like his values and his principles was so good. And he was brilliant at being a talent manager. And managing to persuade him, and there were 3 other partners in the business, 2 of which still remain with us today. But that business was built with an incredibly strong set of values and principles about, doing the right thing, being client first. Incredibly successful roster of talent that it represented, and I think that was transformational. So really, along the way, and I can point to other deals that we've done, but persuading that business to come to us in the same way of Chris Coleman coming to join Fulham from Blackburn was a moment where you think, wow, this has got a real chance. And I learned so much from him about managing talent because he had been talent. So he'd been judged for a long period of time. He really understood what it looked like and was like to be in the public eye. And I learned so much from him. And a lot of my principles got boosted. My confidence around doing the right thing for the longer term was boosted by my relationship with Peter.
Was that the big takeaway from you in terms of that relationship, that doing the right thing to which you refer? I guess my question, what did you learn from Peter? You mentioned you learned a lot. What specifically?
Yeah, I think I'd been maybe that's a difficult wrestle that I've always had in my career, being driven by the economic short-term realisation. We're in a COVID period, so doing what in the short term economically might benefit you, whether that be doing the wrong brand deal, whether that be buying a business that doesn't naturally fit because it's economically driven, or having the courage and listening to the instinct and the wisdom of the people around you to do something in the short term that might even take you backwards in order to go forwards. I think Peter oozed that. He was not financially driven. He was brave around his advice, clear around his advice to clients, very confident around who one should sign and who one shouldn't. That was all about having a view on the capability of the people that we represented and what we could add to them. So, yeah, he gave me that in a sense of the numbers will take care of themselves. You need to be very diligent around that and take, obviously, calculated risk, but actually just do the right thing because time and time again that will pay out. So I think that was a boost to my inner sense and slightly made me less financially driven and more long-term and having the courage to say to do the right thing. And again, I definitely haven't always got that right, but most of the mistakes that I've made are often driven around economics, i.e. that I thought this was going to be a financially good upside versus deep down in my soul that it was going to, make a long-term difference to the organization. I think that is the theme that I've made mistakes on, economic decisions rather than longer-term objectives.
Looking back, would you have done anything differently?
Yeah. I would have definitely been more selective around acquisitions. I would have taken more time to understand the motivations of why people want to sell their companies. I would have had a longer horizon on things like when you're doing covenant and bank debts and private equity deals to make sure that you've got, often when you sell businesses, which have also sold YMU 3 times, that you because there's a financial imperative to maximize that for one shareholders, which, is quite rightly a responsibility as well for the stakeholders, that you always go to the line, both in terms of the valuation and therefore the banking and the covenants that come with that. I would give myself more headroom to make more mistakes. Does that make sense, what I'm saying about the economic pressure that you put yourself under?
Yeah. So management buyout 2009, was that right? You mentioned that was the point. What was the rationale, the thought processes, the journey to get you to that point? You thought, right, this is the right course of action. This is the route to take.
We weren't really going anywhere, to be honest. We were too small to be listed. I think our market cap.
Were you AIM listed?
Yeah. So we'd probably peaked at around 70, 80 million and consistently not really gone anywhere. We floated at 25. We were still at 25. So we were too small to be listed and the proposition wasn't strong enough. So we needed, to unlock some of the financial potential of the organisation and also the direction of it. And I think by taking it private, it just gave us a longer term horizon. And private equity was something that my corporate lawyer, who has been a good partner to me since really 2001, DLA had been my sort of corporate partner, and James Kerrigan particularly had introduced me to an individual again. It's always about people, isn't it? A gentleman called Andy Marsh that ran or was a partner at Gresham. And him and I had met quite a few times. We got to know each other maybe over the course of a year. And he trusted me, which was a big decision at the time because it wasn't a particularly large business. And I trusted him. And so you come back to that, don't you? That's the themes, isn't it, when we talk about it, is people. And he was just very emotionally intelligent. They had a good track record of Gresham of taking small businesses and making them bigger. And so, that was the trigger, really.
And how did you find the difference between running an AIM-listed business and running a private equity-backed business? What were the differences from your perspective? And What impact did that have on the organisation as a consequence?
There were two really simple things for me. One is definitely private equity, weirdly, is more longer term than being listed because you're 6 monthly or quarterly reporting if you're, an American listed entity. So everything fell in years rather than months. And secondly, the access to capital was much quicker. The decision making forum, you were sat opposite the person that could make the decision. Whereas again, when you're seeking to raise capital in a listed sense at a smaller company, you'd go and do the roadshow and it would be quite cumbersome. So you were trying to agree an acquisition and saying this is conditional on getting the money. Whereas in private equity, you knew you could deliver it and the decision would be relatively quick. And it just felt like the horizons were 3, 5, 7 years. There was more of an appetite for risk. So that would be my takeaway.
Consistent through what you've talked about this morning, you constantly, consciously or subconsciously, but found yourself surrounded by great people, made decisions to partner with great people, found yourself in situations where great people have been sat around you. What do you think, with respect to those decisions that have really influenced and shaped the future for the success of YMU, has that also been a better? I mean, you've got a great group of people around you now. I'm guessing that's, again, you've been very careful as to how you've gone about selecting the right people on the right seats.
I mean, look, I continue because I think the constant challenge for me always has been anxiety or my mental health, which is well talked about. And without doubt, my work colleagues have lifted me up on occasions where I felt less confident or I'd made mistakes. So I'm so blessed around the people that I've been fortunate enough to work with. I think the other thing I would take away is often the people, and this, you can take from a lot of self-help books or whatever, but it's sometimes the people that you don't instantly chime with that give you the biggest opportunity to grow. So there are people within this organization, which when I first met them, I didn't necessarily appreciate their perspective or what they were bringing to the table, who've gone on and become, sponsors of mine and people that I've grown to admire and respect. So it's having in a people business, I think the people that you don't instantly match with, those that are slightly more adversarial, is the ones that I always think are the gift and the opportunity to grow. But yeah, I mean, I think we all get judged, don't we, professionally by the people that we are surrounded with. And I've got that right and I've got that wrong. And I'm sure I've, pissed off enough people on the other side who haven't necessarily seen eye to eye to me. But yeah, the people around us, culture, we talk a lot about culture and values and ways of working and stuff. And it's for other people to judge how good we do it, but it's something that we try and believe in. And I think if somebody's not motivated or aligned, especially in a leadership position, then I think organisations have a responsibility to unpick that. Doesn't always mean leave, but that's one of the outcomes. Sometimes it's about having the courage to do what I talked about earlier, which is sit and really come from a place of vulnerability and say, look, this is how I feel when we talk. These are the things what I feel they don't chime with, and try and get to that kernel of truth so that you can move forward. And I've never really had a bad conversation. If you set the right scene and talk from a position of how it makes me feel versus you're doing something wrong, I've always found, even in the most difficult conversations, they lead to better outcomes, which sometimes is separation, sometimes is that you align and move forward. But definitely the people around me, most of the people that I work with are much more talented than I just think that, come back to that sport analogy, I'm a fetcher and carrier, and I'm happy to do that. That's what my strength is versus I'm not a centre forward. Do you know what I mean? I'm not a superstar.
I think, though, that, if you look at if we come back to footballing analogies, I was always fascinated. I think it was Eric Cantona who referred to Didier Deschamps as the water carrier. But this is the guy that lifted the World Cup for France in a team that had Zidane and Henry and all those fabulously talented. That team wouldn't have functioned without Deschamps basically keeping it ticking over in the middle. So you need, I think it takes all sorts. I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about the makeup of a business, that if everybody is fundamentally the same, arguably will it succeed over the long term? It takes all sorts to make that team tick. So if you reflect back, what is the achievement of which you are most proud?
Do you know what? I find that really, really hard to answer. What is the achievement that I'm most proud of? I can't answer that with any form of sincerity. I can't. I think things that go through my mind, it's more almost experiences, the fact that it's probably places that I've been or events that have happened. And I suppose a little bit of me, which is my competitive nature, hopes that I've still got more to come and it's like in the future. There's nothing that that I'm still here, that I'm talking to you, that I'm in the game. Do you know what I mean? I've still got some relevance. The fact that kid from Yeovil that left school with no qualifications is having these conversations. There's nothing obvious. And probably in my personal life, because I've always found relationships in my personal life really difficult. And over the last few years, I feel like I've got a sense of understanding who I am and a little bit more self-confidence. But there's nothing obvious at work that makes me feel hugely proud, which is probably something I need to work on.
So what does success mean to you?
Oh, that's another good question. I don't know. These are interesting things. I like to win. So I suppose Simon Sinek says, doesn't he, that business is infinite. So it's a moment in time. So I think there are windows of time when I felt we've achieved things, whether the last sale in 2018 when the business had sort of trebled in size over a relatively short period of time. So that had a sort of a measurement period because it was a crystallization of value, and a lot of my peers and myself were sort of financially rewarded for that. But I think success is infinite and it's ongoing. It's just a moment in time.
We'll come back to sport because we're both big football fans, but I think it was, we're reading about Sir Alex Ferguson that, whenever in those great United sides, whenever they were to celebrate a big win, the treble or whatever it might have been, it was kind of like you have that one night of celebration. You get up the following morning and he's already on to, right, what does next season look like? What do we need? How do we repeat the success? It's relentless, yeah. But you have that one moment. Do you celebrate success?
We talk about, we have some values in the organisation. I'm always told that I'm not very good at it. And I think that's true. I've been told that so many times. I don't particularly have the high. I always feel like more challenged by what's coming and actually very aware of what we need to do better. So I'm not a brilliant celebrator of success, definitely. I'm not, never have been.
And I find that fascinating, if only from my own experience, if I reflect on conversations like this that I've had over many years, that's a consistent theme. Most people that certainly from a business perspective, we might measure or assume to have enjoyed some success, will share a similar thought process. It's a quick reflection. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's ever a pat on the back even. I've often had it said that, that sense that if I pat myself on the back too hard, that's when I'm going to get a kick up the proverbial. But actually that's when it will come and bite me. So there's a flicker of acknowledgement and and we move on to the next one. In some cases, there's arguably a sense of, well, that success we've enjoyed, so we bloody well should have done because we've worked so tremendously hard to ensure that would happen. But then there is that sense of, right, on to the next challenge. And I think that momentum is what is a really interesting characteristic over people it's relentless. There's never a sense that you've arrived. It's a journey, and that journey is constantly, to your point around Simon Sinek, it's infinite. So what do you do to relax? You've got offices all over the world. You're traveling, building a business to the extent that you have with the success that you've enjoyed is relentless, as we've acknowledged. Do you unwind? Do you relax? And if so, how do you achieve it?
I'm really simple, I think I'm naturally an introvert rather than extrovert, which is interesting, bearing in mind I'm surrounded by people that are in the public arena. So that probably is the yin and yang of why it works. So sport, I can pretty much watch any sport and I'll watch television, and I'm really basic. I like staying in, I like sleeping, I go to the gym, which I don't particularly like, but I do it. So yeah, I'm really, really simple. There's no sort of secret hobby or anything else. It's pretty basic stuff because I think I'm always using a lot of nervous energy, maybe most of the time. So when it comes to not working, lucky enough to have 5 children, so that keeps me active as well, and I really enjoy being a dad. But there's not a lot left, and I just want to rest, and that's often sitting in front of the television.
Are you a reader? Do you read? Do you listen to music?
I was dyslexic at school, so reading's not natural for me. I think when I was if I go back to, when I was the hungriest, I would listen to something like, I don't know, in the UK, Wake Up to Money, which is obviously the BBC's sort of business program. I would read the business pages. I religiously try and read The Economist. I think that's the best publication. I always remember told that if I could just read The Economist every week from cover to cover, I think that takes me 90% of the way towards the macro issues. I think they have the best journalists, and it's an incredible publication. And I try, and historically I've read self-help books. I try and read business books. But as I've had more children, that gets harder. There is, I always think that's a choice, isn't it, where one spends their time, but I think that's made it harder. I love audio. So I try and read a lot of the trade publications, but also I've read enough to think that if you read the trade publications too much, often you end up with that herd mentality. You do what everybody else does. So I have themes of trying to read things outside of my sector, which is why I love The Economist, because I think it's such a, almost anybody that wants to aspire from a young age to be in business, I always say to them, just read. If you read The Economist for a year, any interview, conversation you have, you'll be able to have a view, even whether it's right or wrong.
So who do you look up to in business or in life generally?
I think often it's sports people that have dealt with adversity, or the politicians at the moment, regardless of one's political colour. Who wants that job at the moment? Yeah, so often somebody that always comes to mind, somebody like Adam Crozier in the UK from a business perspective, who's ran the FA, ran the post office, ran ITV, is humble, accessible, is that character that can deal with, I remember running the post office and getting physical and verbal threats, or David Gill, some of these people that have had dignity and elegance in times of crisis, probably for me, because I think I look at that and I think I probably couldn't do it. I think I could run things that were successful, but actually when you're in the teeth of adversity in a sporting or a leadership or a political sense, I'm not sure I would be able to hold myself to the same standard that they are.
Interesting. So what advice would you give 21-year-old Neil Rodford?
To enjoy it a little bit more and to take, to try and value the moments, maybe celebrate the success a little bit more, but actually, to do most of it again, but just realize that things pass, good and bad, and actually to recognize that it will be okay.
And what about advice that you would give to anyone with a dream who's looking to make it happen? What pearls of wisdom would you share?
Read as much as you possibly read, and I don't mean literally read, but listen to audio, read across. If you're talking about business, then read the business pages, read and digest as much as you can. I touched on The Economist. And then I think the truth is, and that's maybe me, but you just have to work harder than everybody else, because I think ability gets you somewhere, but resilience and determination and that tenacity to keep going. I think that's true of talent. If you look at the most elite talent, you touched on Ronaldo and Messi or whoever else that we've touched on here, they work harder than everybody else as well. So they match ability with determination. So you just got to, if you're doing something you're passionate and you love, it's easy, right? If you're doing something you're not in love with, then business is really tough.
Yeah. So what does the future look like for Neil Rodford? What does the future hold?
I'd like to get into a position where I could be more of a coach and less of an executive, because I think it's a younger person's industry, the media sector, and therefore I'd like to get into that a little bit more. And I'd like to you asked the question about find some passions and some hobbies that aren't business. So develop something outside of work would be an objective of mine, to sort of, enjoy my family a little bit more and not constantly be thinking about work.
Fascinating. Neil, it's been great to speak with you. You've been very candid, very honest, very authentic, and that really does shine through and come across. And I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks for joining me today, and look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.